We're talking about my recent trip to Israel in 2023, so that I can hopefully twist some of your guys' arms to coming with me in 2025. Um, so I'll pull the audience for interest at the end. But there's just simply no way to show you all 17 days worth of photos in one night. So it's just going to be the first few days, and as we have the opportunity, I will keep putting the bug in your ear by showing you some more at later dates. So we're focusing on Galilee and the Golan Heights, which were the first few days that we did. So on day one, as we arrived, we came into a beautiful, beautiful view. Daytime, it was about 4 p.m. when we landed, so there wasn't much time to do anything on the first day. We went from Tel Aviv right to our hotel, and they had buffet breakfasts for morning and evening. And that was really about all the food we needed, because we could eat as much as we possibly wanted, and we could even take some for the road. So essentially all of our meals were taken care of as part of the deal. And they had really good food, so nobody wanted to buy elsewhere anyways. It was well, eating a Mediterranean diet for 2 weeks. I could easily go 2 years without eating anything else, as long as they would let me mix meat and cheese at some point, but not a chance of that.
Have you over breakfast?
I've got a breakfast picture here coming up next, I think. This was our hotel. It was right on the beach in...
Beautiful.
Can't remember exactly where, but it was just north of Tel Aviv, barely south of Caesarea.
Oh, nice.
So day two, we started out once again with a beautiful view. This is actually, I think, about 6 a.m. So sun had
that's incredible.
And we had to be eating breakfast by 7 because we were out and about by 7:30. This was our group. It ended up being a pretty small group, 28 or 29 people. The bus fits 50, so that was our max. But it was fun. We got to know each other pretty well, and made some lasting friendships.
Where was everybody from?
Let's see. Most of them were from Albuquerque. More than half from Albuquerque, 5 or 6 from Arizona and Texas, and 1 from West Virginia, and then myself and Doug were from Washington. So it was a good good representation of the southern states that could handle heat. So the Dead Sea area was nothing for them, but Doug and I and the woman from West Virginia, we turned beet red.
Really hot.
It was very hot, but by the Mediterranean and up in the Sea of Galilee was really nice, and Jerusalem stays pretty cool as well. What would you ask, Karen?
Well, what kind of temperatures?
For Galilee, it was anywhere between 70 and 85. The Dead Sea, or the whole Jordan Valley, especially in the Dead Sea, and one place especially called Masada, that got between 95 and 105.
Wow.
Yeah, and the Dead Sea gives absolutely no relief. Like getting a nice cool breeze off of the Sea of Galilee was nice. No such thing in the Dead Sea. It's a hellscape. Beautiful, but I would not want to be stranded out there. So this is the Mediterranean coast at Caesarea. It was a large deep water port built by Herod in order to please Rome. These are some artifacts they've dug up there. There's a millstone over there, and this was probably a feeding trough. The site at Caesarea had basically 2,000 years of history, being toppled by earthquakes or armies and rebuilt by the Crusaders, by the Muslims, by the Jews, by the Byzantines. So really everything you're looking at has a different history, and they take stones from one thing to to build another thing, and you can sometimes barely tell which is which. So it was a lot of cool history there right off the bat. This is Herod's swimming pool, right on the beach. He was he didn't really spare any expenses on himself. In fact, pretty much every magnificent sight we saw was either King Ahab's or Herod's. So some of the worst kings in the Bible have some of the most lasting footprints in the land. But then there's, of course, King David and King Solomon, and they have some pretty astounding things in Jerusalem itself that are still standing today. Over here, there's a field, that's the hippodrome. That's where they would race chariots. There's quite a big complex over here. In the back, there's a Crusader complex. It was a giant chapel. You can see a Muslim minaret here, right smack dab in the middle. And on the left is a lighthouse and a prison. And this is where Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea, probably while Luke wrote his gospel. Luke was one of Paul's disciples and spent the time that Paul was imprisoned in Caesarea to, I guess, basically interview people in Israel and get the facts of what happened, and then write it down into a gospel. So we got Luke, the Gospel of Luke, while Paul was imprisoned here. And Paul wrote a few prison letters from here as well, I think Philippians being one of them. So here's the other side, the deep water bay, which isn't so deep anymore. It's pretty much silted up. And out beyond this jetty, there was a larger jetty that when the light hits it right, you can still see it underwater out there. But it toppled in an earthquake in about 749. So it's no longer there. And this was a very impressive aqueduct that they brought all the way from the Carmel mountain range, stretches about 8 miles, and has less than a foot gradient from one end to the other. So they were pretty precise in their measurements, and it brought water all the way to Caesarea from the Carmel Mountains. After that, we went inland a bit. This is going through the Carmel Mountain range. This is a grave, but this is not a rich man's grave. This would be a poor man's grave. It's a tomb, and the tombstone's probably not even 3 feet tall. It would have been much larger for a rich man tomb. You would really have to bend down and crawl in here. But there's room for a few different graves in here, and it's just off the side of the road as you're driving driving through the mountains. Once we got up to the top of Mount Carmel, we're able to look over the valley, the Via Maris, which was a main highway, in the old sense of the word, a main highway where armies would come through here, kings would come through here. The other side of the Jordan, there's another similar highway called the King's Highway. This was the one that went along the sea, so it was very popular. Up on top of Mount Carmel, this is where Elijah had his contest with the prophets of Baal, where he exercised his funny bone by taunting them when their God wouldn't bring down fire and accept their sacrifices. He asks them, "What's wrong? Is your God on the toilet?" So we know that Elijah had a sense of humor, in some ways reflecting God's sense of humor. But anyways, they lost the battle, and he went down into the valley and killed them all. So quite a bit of history, and here's the valley with the river. I can't remember the name of the river now, but that river is just down there in the valley where he slaughtered all of the prophets of Baal. And up there on the mountain, there's a Druze village. Druze are a sect of Muslims that broke off pretty early on, like hundreds of years ago. They broke off for the purpose of women's rights. They wanted the women to be equal to the men, which is not something that is true in Muslim communities generally. So they have almost no contact with the Muslims, and they've pretty much developed as a separate religious group and an isolated community because they also only marry within Druze villages or Druze communities. They believe in reincarnation, but they believe in humans reincarnating into other humans, not other things, and that there is only a certain number of Druze, and when one dies, another is born. So you don't marry outside of a Druze community because then your child won't reincarnate another Drew, and that person will just be gone. So there's a lot of guilt tied up in it, but they're a very peaceful people that don't bother the Israelis one bit at all. The ones up in the north used to be part of Syria, and so they still kind of like that Syrian heritage and don't call themselves Israelis, even though they're in Israeli territory now. But that's also partly from fear of if Syria ever takes back the Golan Heights, if they had at any time aligned with Israel, they're in big trouble with Syria. So they're kind of playing their odds there and saying, well, Israel doesn't care if we don't identify with Israel, but Syria would care if we did. So they're playing it safe. But anyways, most of the times when we did stop for lunch, we stopped in Druze villages because it's cheap food, and this is actually what they call fast food.
That looks good.
Well,
Falafel.
yeah,
What's that
falafel
between the two pita bread?
and schnitzel in between the pita bread.
So is that like a veal or something, or schnitzel? What's schnitzel?
It's just chicken.
Chicken. Oh,
Yeah.
Well, it can be it.
chicken can be fried.
It can
Anything
be
fried.
anything, but it was always chicken. It was brought over. The custom of schnitzel was brought over by the Ashkenazis, so they adopted it into one of their main food groups. Is schnitzel. It's everywhere in Israel. So we continued on from Mount Carmel. When you get on the other side of the Carmel mountain range from the Via Maris or from the coastal plains, you end up in the Jezreel Valley. So this is the beginning of the Jezreel Valley. And if you remember the Jezreel Valley from when we studied it in Revelation, there's a mountain in it called Megiddo. And mountain in Hebrew is Har. So we've got Har Megiddo, where we get the name Armageddon from. So this is the Valley of Armageddon. I'll go back so you can look at it. While standing on Tel Megiddo, which is the little hill where there's lots of archaeological discoveries. So this is the valley where the Antichrist will stage his army to go in and attack Jerusalem before he goes down and tries to choke out Petra.
Are those olive trees?
I don't think so. The olive trees look a little different. We'll see some olive trees before the time's out. They have a very interesting program there. I can't remember what it's called, but essentially it's almost impossible to cut down a tree in Israel. There's so much red tape, but they do all sorts of tree planting efforts. Like kids in their school, once a year they'll go out and plant a tree with their whole class, and then those trees are cared for 2 years by the government before they're let to grow wild. They plant thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of trees every year, and sometimes when we were driving through the Carmel Mountains or the foothills of Jerusalem, there's just so many trees. It's almost overwhelming, even coming from Washington. So there's just so much growth and plants and fruit and vegetables and trees of all sorts in Israel right now. And it's really amazing. The plants literally just grow out of rocks. They don't need soil even. It's something you can see God's hand working in the country. So this is Tel Megiddo. A tell is kind of different from a hill. It's not naturally occurring, but it's a civilization that's been built up and then another one built on it, another one built on it. So you can dig down through layers of civilization. And Tel Megiddo has 30 different layers of different civilizations, where one has been wiped out and another's come and built on top of it. Sometimes it's not totally a new civilization, but a disaster will level the place, or innovation within a society. They'll just begin building on top of what they had. But when they get down to the foundations of Tel Megiddo, there's even Hittite remnants from before Abram was in the land. This is a Hittite sacrificial altar, where they've even found burnt and charred bones on it. So this was always a very active area in Israel, and you can see there's lots of build up on top of that. That's pretty low here in the Tel. But Tel Megiddo is one of the main military high points in Israel. They had They have Hatzor in the north, and Beersheba in the south, and then Tel Megiddo in the middle. And these are high points where they're able to see a great distance. You saw into the Jezreel Valley. It's important because that's where any military activity, they would cross through that region, going from Europe down into Africa or vice versa. So it was an important highway, and they needed to be able to protect it militarily, especially in case of siege. And the problem with a tell or a big hill is you don't really have access to the food and water that they grow in the valleys or that you find in the valleys. So King Ahab, if you're familiar with him in the Old Testament, he was a dirty, rotten king. His mistress was Jezebel. So there was an encounter we saw with Elijah just a minute ago. He was actually kind of a titan of industry in Israel. And many of the places you go, it's so Ahab built that, and Ahab built that, and Ahab built that. And one thing that Ahab was particularly good at was getting water to hard-to-reach places. And so they have this hill that's in the middle of a valley, and its spring is about half a mile away from the hill in the valley. And the question is, if you're under siege, held up in this strong tower, how do you get water to withstand the siege? And Ahab's industrious innovation here was to dig down into the bedrock, to dig a tunnel from the hill through the valley to the spring, and to block off the spring from being visible within the valley, so that conquering armies wouldn't know that there's even a spring there. And so we walked through Ahab's tunnel here all the way to the spring of water, which I couldn't get a good picture of the spring because it was dark and you couldn't tell it was water. But there's still water in the spring now. And as we're coming out here, you can see how he blocked it off with stones, and then they covered over it with dirt, and they've uncovered it in order to make it a tourist attraction now. All right, from Tel Megiddo, we drove across the valley a little further. This is Nazareth that you can see in the distance, and it's impossible to get a picture of all of Nazareth in one shot from the ground, because it stretches over the hilltop around the other side. It's a pretty big city, but it's also really built up now. It's a modern city, and so there are very few archaeological sites to even see in it, unfortunately. So we didn't go into Nazareth, but we went to a city on the other hillside, the other hilltop, called Sepphoris, or Sippari, which is probably where Mary, the mother of Jesus, grew up, so just across the valley from Nazareth. And it's also one of the major Roman cities in the area. It was the capital of Galilee under Roman control. And as you can see, there's lots of archaeological discoveries down there in the hilltop, including many really well-preserved Roman mosaics. In fact, they just lie in the floors there. You look in every direction and there's just mosaics. But also there's a a synagogue of the Jews that's still standing. And this Sippori, or Sepphoris, in Galilee is an interesting site because when Rome decided to finally squash the Jewish rebellion, they left the Jews in Sepphoris alone because you can't really destroy your own city. This is the Roman capital. So they even let the synagogue remain relatively untouched. And this is the place where I can't remember which Rabbi Akiba, in like the 3rd or the 4th century after Christ, compiled what's called the Mishnah, which is a written record of the oral law or the traditions of the elders that Jesus, essentially the laws written in the Mishnah were the reason that Israel rejected Jesus, because the Mishnaic laws claimed to be the true and pure interpretation of the Mosaic law, but in fact they were a human corruption of them. And so in chapters of scripture like the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, Jesus is continually saying to these Pharisees and to all the people of Israel, you have heard it said, but it is written. And this is a formula that he uses to say, this is your oral law, this is the tradition passed down through your elders, but that's not correct. This is what's written in the law of Moses. He's correcting the doctrine of the Pharisees, and this is why the Pharisees don't like Jesus and try to get rid of him and eventually have to escalate to killing him because they just can't get rid of him. So these laws were finally written down in about the 3rd or 4th century in the Mishnah, and it was the rabbi who was in this synagogue here that wrote them down. And those Mishnah laws are where we get things like not being able to eat any meat and cheese together. So a lot of the kosher laws are not actually biblical at all, and in fact stem from the very doctrines that crucified Christ. I don't have a lot of love lost for the kosher laws. There were true kosher laws under the law, but we are also not under law. But also the specific iterations of the kosher laws that they abide by are not biblical. They're Mishnaic. They come from the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is not biblical. This temple is famous for being the temple or synagogue of that rabbi. I think his name was Rabbi Akiba, but I could be wrong on that. So after we left Sepphoris, we drove to the Sea of Galilee, which you can see just a sliver of down there. But I chose this picture because this cliff here is called Mount Arbel. And this is the cliff where they tried to throw Jesus off the edge. When Jesus was in Nazareth at his own temple, or synagogue rather, and he was at his own synagogue, and he was handed a scroll to read, and he read a portion of it and then stopped and said, "Today this is fulfilled in your hearing." And everyone was amazed and wondered what he meant. And it was a messianic prophecy. This is recorded in Luke. It's a messianic prophecy, and then he tells them that a prophet is not accepted in his own hometown, but this message is going to be brought to the Gentiles, and the Gentiles are going to receive it, and they'll receive the blessings of it. And essentially what he said was, the Messiah is here, and you're about to reject him, but the Gentiles are going to get your blessing instead. And so naturally this made them pretty upset, and they dragged him across the Nazareth hills to Mount Arbel and tried to throw him off. But then suddenly when they went to go throw him, he was nowhere to be found. He had simply vanished. So they did not succeed in throwing him off Mount Arbel. Here we got to our hotel on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, and really small over here. In fact, it blends in with the hillside. You can just see a difference in the shadow. That's Mount Arbel across the Sea of Galilee.